welcome everyone to this training session for the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and Commonwealth and Imperial History. So the way that we're going to run this is that my colleague Mandy Banton and I are going to talk about some of the resources that you might want to use, both physical resources and also online resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the online resources that the Institute has. But first, I'm going to hand over to Mandy to give her presentation.
So where was I? What I said was I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, on these four topics. With the exception of the second, these are original documents held in the National Archives of the UK. Virtually none have been digitised, so access requires a trip to Kew. 2 years ago, I was told that the publisher Gale was planning to make the Colonial Office records available online, but I don't know if there's been any progress. In the meantime, TNA's website provides its catalogue and a range of guidance. Can you see that one?
Yeah.
For example, this guide to records of colonies and dependencies from 1782. In referring to the records of the Colonial Office, I'm not talking about those of a single government department, but rather the accumulation of documents held under the letter code CO. The Colonial Office, as a separate government department, existed only from 1854 to 1966. But the Colonial Office collection covers a period of over 400 years, from 1570 to 1990. The immediate predecessor of the Colonial Office was the War and Colonial Department, 1801 to 1854. Before 1801, there were numerous arrangements for the conduct of British relations with its colonial empire. In the early days, various committees of the Privy Council dealt with the plantations, as the colonies were known. Plantation, of course, signifying not a horticultural enterprise, but a New England planted in foreign soil. At the end of the 17th century, a more permanent body was established with the cumbersome name of the Lord Commissioners for promoting the trade of our kingdom and for inspecting and improving our plantations in America and elsewhere, known as the Board of Trade. Colonial affairs were then the responsibility of the board and two secretaries of state in partnership. The board was abolished after the loss of the American colonies. It was quickly reinstated, but did not resume a primary involvement in colonial affairs. The records were gradually brought together in the 19th century. Most are devoted to individual dependencies, although by the mid-20th century, some correspondence is organised in subject series, such as economics or social services. They fall into a number of categories, the main ones being these. There are also collections of maps and photographs. I will concentrate on the correspondence and its main finding aid, but just to explain the others. Acts are statutes of the local legislature. It was comparatively rare for the UK Parliament to legislate for the colonies. Sessional papers are the proceedings of those legislatures. Government gazettes are the official newspapers, and miscellaneous series tend to comprise only the annual blue books, which provide statistical information, although there is sometimes other content, such as local newspapers. Original correspondence consists of the formal letters known as dispatches sent by the colonial governors to the Colonial Office in London, together with correspondence from British government departments and from institutions and individuals in the UK relating to the dependencies. Organisations and individuals in the colonies were not officially allowed to write to London, although some found ways of circumventing that rule. Volumes of correspondence include notes of discussion within the Colonial Office and usually drafts or copies of replies. The correspondence is highly miscellaneous in its subject matter. Governors did not report everything to London. They had varied degrees of autonomy, and before the introduction of the telegraph in the 19th century, had no way of making quick contact in an emergency. Thus, events which are important to the history of a territory may hardly be mentioned unless reported on at a later date, whereas quite trivial matters can give rise to extensive correspondence. There is a mix of high-level policy and minor administrative matters, but also much of local or personal interest. If we're interested in, for example, Mauritius, TNA's catalogue will tell us that the original correspondence is in the series CO167. It will provide a note on the arrangement of the volumes and give reference to related series, and refer to the original finding aids. These finding aids are usually the only way into the correspondence, most of which has not been catalogued by subject before 1926, when files replace bound volumes. Volume levels, the catalogue gives only this remarkably limited information. I don't know what was happening in Mauritius in 1861, but there are 9 volumes of governors' dispatches for that year, plus 3 of correspondence from organisations and individuals. One volume may hold between 300 and 500 pages. So to find what we're looking for, we need to consult the register of correspondence received in the Colonial Office. This one, as you can see, covers 1861 to 62. This image is actually from the Nigeria register for 1919. I'm not expecting you to read this very poor reproduction, and I've lost the first column on the left, which gives the date of receipt in the Colonial Office. This is not a copy of that register page, but a collection of individual entries brought together to illustrate certain points. I would like to go through them, but there is not enough time. So just to say that there is sufficient information to be able to locate a particular dispatch, the action taken, any related papers, and if papers have been printed. If an item has been destroyed, as is the case with the second entry from the bottom, there is sufficient information to pull the story together. Although, as I said, virtually none of the Colonial Office records have been digitised, TNA has been able to make a start at proper cataloguing of some of the Caribbean correspondence. So, for example, CO28107, a Barbados volume, would previously have been described simply as dispatches 1831. But there are now brief descriptions of the 77 items within the volume, covering subjects such as the illegal removal of enslaved people from Barbados to Trinidad, the complexities of paying a pension to a former Royal Navy seaman who is now enslaved, and reports of a major hurricane. I'm not going to say any more about the Colonial Office records, but would refer you to my guide, published initially in paperback, but available since September 2020 as an open access online edition. To move on, John Levin, editor of British History Online, couldn't be here today, so I suggested saying a little about the calendar of state papers Colonial, America and West Indies, which he would have discussed with far more expertise. The 45 volumes are available in hard copy, published between 1860 and 1994, but are now also reproduced in British History Online. As John says, there is much valuable material there. The calendar provides transcripts, précis, or brief summaries of documents relating to the American and Caribbean colonies. It includes material on French, Dutch, and Spanish possessions, and in view of the importance of the slave trade, some relating to the west coast of Africa. Calendars, essentially an early and ambitious form of cataloguing, were intended to provide a précis full enough for most purposes to replace the original documents. I browsed the first volume, which covers the years 1574 to 1660, and found many entries on Virginia and Bermuda and on relations with the Spanish. This one from Guyana in 1604 presents a somewhat unbelievable and rosy picture of early colonization attempts. As an Africanist, my eye was drawn to this one from July 1625, seeking various information from West Africa. In addition to the records of the Secretaries of State and the Board of Trade and its predecessors, the calendar includes documents from many other series. This results mainly from the lack of a clearly separate administration of colonial affairs before the late 17th century, but also from the presence of some colonial content in papers from other spheres of government. The calendar was intended to continue to the years of the American Revolution, but was abandoned in the 1990s when it had covered only the years 1574 to 1739. It was just too labor intensive. Because this session was originally billed as covering sources to Commonwealth history rather than Imperial and Commonwealth, and because I was conscious that the Colonial Office had little, if any, formal responsibility for the Commonwealth, I decided to say something about records relating to colonial, imperial, and Commonwealth conferences, the origins of what are now the Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings. Prior to the establishment of the Commonwealth Secretariat in 1965, the Secretariat keeps its own records. This is from a meeting in 1986, which agreed a programme of economic sanctions against apartheid South Africa. 20 years ago, I and the then librarian at the Secretariat put together this volume. It describes about 120 conferences and lists relevant TNA documents, plus a few from the Secretariat, which had only just started releasing its records. TNA's catalogue was not then online, so the volume almost certainly misses some material that could now be easily found, plus anything later than 1960s. It includes the early colonial conferences from 1887 to 1907, followed by Imperial conferences. Commonwealth starts to appear in conferences titles from the mid-1930s. The Colonial Office provided the Secretariat for the earliest conferences, but the development during the First World War of an Imperial War Cabinet and an Imperial War Conference ended its monopoly permanently. Thereafter, the Cabinet Office played an increasingly significant role, together with the Dominions Office, which split off from the Colonial Office in 1925. The lists continue to note scattered Colonial Office records, as well as those of other government departments, according to the subject matter discussed. My final section, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Migrated Archives. One morning in April 2011, BBC News noted a report in the Times of the so-called discovery of papers supporting a class action brought against the UK government by veterans of the struggle for independence in Kenya, surviving members of the movement known as Mau Mau. I bought a copy and found this front page story. It confirmed rumours and half-truths long in circulation. It was the persistence of the lawyers and expert witnesses in the High Court case that finally forced the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to admit its holding of colonial government records, not only from Kenya, but from a total of 37 former dependencies. On the 5th of May 2011, the then Foreign Secretary, William Hague, announced in the House of Commons not that the migrated archives had been discovered, as the Times article said, but that the FCO had become aware of their significance. It was his intention to release every part of every paper of interest, subject only to legal exemptions. I think we're fortunate that Haig was then Secretary of State. As an historian and biographer, he appreciated the importance of the records and was prepared to set aside political considerations. Some, at least, of his officials disagreed with his decision. Throughout the long years of decolonisation, British colonial authorities had been systematically destroying local government records and removing others to the UK. Prior to the independence of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, in 1949, Colonial Office officials anxiously debated whether the records belonged to the UK or to the successor government. An official noted the dual responsibilities of the governor and thus a way in which documentation could be split. It was impossible to translate such a distinction into the sorting of bound papers, and 464 volumes of dispatches dating back to 1835 were sent to London. In the 1950s, as the Gold Coast and Malaysia became independent, the Colonial Office worked out a policy, and in 1961 standard instructions were issued. They did not refer to the removal of documents to London, but rather set out the type of material which should not be left for ministers in the incoming governments, as shown here. Eventually, government records from 37 former dependencies were sent to London. By the time the FCO admitted their existence in 2011, there were about 20,000 files. It is known that some top secret papers were unaccountably lost, but not if any were deliberately destroyed in the UK. Although the Foreign and Commonwealth Office denied the existence of this collection for decades, there is evidence that some papers were used in answering questions from other government departments, from Parliament, and occasionally from private researchers. A long-standing claim by former residents of the Chagos Islands to be allowed to return home limped slowly through the British courts for many years. 5 files were removed from the migrated archives in connection with the case, perhaps in 1975, and returned in 1999 when they were found in what is described as a remote storage area. A redacted minute instructs, do not, heavily underlined, do not disclose the existence of the migrated records, a clear indication that they were not made available to the claimants, but may have been used to support the British defence. Over the years, there were regular discussions within the FCO and between the and TNA about the status of the records. A legal opinion in 1976 stated that they were not UK public records, but in 2011, immediately prior to admitting their custody, the FCO acquired another legal opinion, which states that they are. Unfortunately, FCO refuses to release the wording of that opinion or of the ministerial briefing given to the lawyers. The files were released to TNA in 2012-2013, where they are available under the reference FCO 141. FCO will not consider their return to the 37 countries concerned, nor will it consider digitising them so that they can be shared. It persists in arguing that anyone can visit TNA or order copies. This is another huge topic, but I must leave it there. My final slide. A member of the Colonial Office registry staff consulting a register of correspondence in 1942. Believe it or not, she is called Miss Heritage. Thank you. I will now hand back to Professor Murphy.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to try to share my screen now. And I hope you can see that. I'm going to talk about a couple of resources that we have online at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. the British Documents on the End of Empire project volumes, and the Commonwealth Oral History project volumes. And if I've got time, I'll talk briefly also about our Ruth First project, which I think is really interesting. And I'm also going to go back to the subject of the Hanslope Park, or so-called migrated archives, because it's relevant here. Okay, so one of the sort of long-standing research projects of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies was British Documents on the End of Empire. That ran from 1987 until the sort of mid to late 2000s. And it was in two tranches, really. The first was funded by the British Academy, the second by the AHRC. And the important thing to mention about this is that it's not, unlike the Foreign Office publications, British Documents on Foreign Policy, it's not an official history series. The editors of these volumes were independent scholars, and I was one of the editors. I edited the Central Africa volumes, and we just had the ordinary access that members of the public had. I mean, when I was editing these volumes, I put in freedom of information requests for files that were still closed. Most of them were opened, some of them not. And that was, I mean, that was working in the early 2000s, when there was a slightly more liberal attitude to the release of papers. In the early stages of the project, in the sort of the late 80s, early 90s, the authorities were far less willing to release material they considered sensitive, particularly around intelligence. So that's going to affect what's in those volumes and what isn't. This is the website, bdeep.org, and what we did a few years ago was simply to digitize what had been a series of hard copy volumes. And I think we were worried, in a sense, that those volumes weren't being used as widely as they perhaps could have been, because they're a tremendous resource. And it was partly because the volumes were so expensive. I mean, you know, running into the hundreds of pounds, and even university libraries could probably afford only one, and once those were missing, well, they were gone. So it seemed like a bit of a no-brainer to us to just digitize everything. And we did it in a fairly sort of basic way. So again, the second round of volumes, which I was involved in, the stationery office, which published them, provided digitized copies were available. So we were just able to put those online. With the earlier volumes, we were simply kind of taking sort of hard copies and photographing them. So you can still see the sort of the underlinings, the annotations in these PDFs that we produced. But all the same, I think they're a tremendous resource. There were three main series in BD. So Series A, you can see here if I bring it up. These were sort of broad chronological spans. Running from 1925 to 45, 45 to 51, the Attlee government, 51, 57, Churchill, Eden, the Macmillan governments, and then 64 to 71. So that brings in both sort of Wilson and early Heath governments. And what they provide is a kind of an overview of British government policy. So a mixture of Prime Minister's Office, Colonial Office, Commonwealth Relations Office files over a range of different topics. That was Series A. Series B are the country volumes. And so it's, I wouldn't say it's hit and miss what's covered and what isn't, but it is a little bit arbitrary. So some of those early volumes, you see Ghana, Sri Lanka, Malaya, partly because those were countries that received their independence relatively early. So you could bring it right through to independence. And then later on in the series, the West Indies, Nigeria, Malaysia, going right through to the Malaysian Federation, Fiji, Malta. I did Central Africa, which is basically Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi now. And then finally, if you could see series 3, which is a much shorter series, the records of the Colonial Office. And those are 2 sets of guides produced by Anne Thurston. And they're, they're from the 90s now. They're not entirely in date, but they're still quite useful. And they cover some of the ground that Mandy talked about. Just sort of very, very quickly, as I say, we didn't have access to, to things that weren't generally available. And we didn't know about the Hounslow Park papers, these so-called migrated archives, as editors. Would it have made a difference? Well, I think that if anyone had, but by chance, and this is what I was saying about the slightly arbitrary nature of what's there and what isn't, there were never volumes produced on either Kenya or Cyprus. They were commissioned, but for various reasons they just didn't. They were never finalized. And so if you want to sort of find out about Kenya, there's material in the general volumes. I think that editors would probably have wanted to incorporate some of the Hounslow papers, but they're different sorts of material. The Hounslow papers are essentially records produced by the local governments, the territorial governments, rather than by Whitehall. And that's really important to remember. So it's a different class of information. And I think that the feeling is probably in terms of Hounslow that it added elements to our understanding of colonial policy in those territories. But I suspect it wouldn't have sort of changed the overall conclusions that editors of the BD series drew. What's really interesting, what's really useful in those volumes is not just the material itself, but the introductions, which give you a kind of an overview of colonial policy towards those territories by experts in the field. So you can download the PDFs, you can do word searches on the PDFs, which is tremendously helpful often. And sometimes, you find another sort of striking thing about the whole Hounslow saga was that I suppose journalists thought that this was hugely secret information which would change our whole view. And sometimes they found documents in the Hounslow papers and they thought, this is extraordinary. This shows how brutal British colonialism was. And actually, they were sometimes copies of documents that had been published in the 1990s in the BD volumes. So often journalists just didn't realize what was out there, what was in the public domain. And that, again, I mean, it gives a further sort of impetus to publish this material online. Let me just sort of go into, because my, so the Commonwealth Oral History Project, because I can't see my menu. up here. Okay. I'm going to go in through just my basic sort of Google search, which is what you do. Okay, so this is the second big project I'm going to talk about, and we're very lucky actually. Sue Onslow, who was the lead researcher on this, I saw joining the chat. So maybe Sue will be able to sort of come in and say a few words or answer questions that you have. But I'll just go through it really quickly. This was a big project that we actually did digitally from the start, rather than simply digitizing materials that we had at a later stage. So this was an HRC funded project which ran between 2012 and 2015. And the object of the exercise was to make available around 60 recordings with major figures across the Commonwealth. So Sue, effectively, who did almost all of the interviews, interviewed all of the surviving Commonwealth Secretary Generals at that point. So Sani Ramphal, Emeka Onyuku, Don McKinnon, Kamala Sharma, Arnold Smith, the first Secretary General, had died by that stage. But we got to all the others. Commonwealth foreign ministers, Commonwealth prime ministers, some prime ministers of Australia. And you can see on the main website here, the interviews arranged by name. So you get, if you click that, you get a sort of alphabetical listing. And say Emeka Onyuku, who was Secretary General between 1990 and 98. So what you'll see, there were two separate interviews with Emeka. There's an online version that you see, but also if you tap the transcript, you'll get a PDF of the interview. And that's useful in terms of citing these because of the page numbers to these. And we give you also citation advice on this. So the recordings are transcribed, and it's important to say what the process was, because the interviewees were then sort of sent the transcripts and were able to correct them, sometimes rather more than correct them. You know, it's always a shock to people when they see their recorded words down on paper and they want to sort of turn it into proper English, or, you know, I didn't get that quite right. So it's important to remember that they'd gone back, they'd looked at it, but also they checked it for accuracy, which is really, really important. And so you'll see these interviews, they're organized alphabetically. Just sort of go back here to time, sort of go back into the system. Because I just want to show you a few more features of this. So that they're organized alphabetically, these interviews. They're organized, you'll see, by subject matter, and they're organized by country. And there was also something that was organized as part of this, a witness seminar at the Commonwealth Secretariat in June 2013. And the Commonwealth Secretariat, the kind of the coordinating body created in 1965. So people who'd worked within the Secretariat over the years in various different departments, the Office of the Secretary General, Political Legal Affairs, Development, Education, Health, and the comms people. And it was lovely because we did that in the sort of the kind of the main drawing room in Marlborough House. There was a real sense of memories flooding back. And again, these interviews were transcribed. So the interviews are the sort of the main resource that we made available, and Sue did the most incredible job preparing for these interviews and really kind of drawing people out on the sorts of things that historians would be interested in terms of the modern Commonwealth. But we've also got, if you click on other resources, we've got another sort of set of useful things here. So we've got a bibliography of Commonwealth history. We've got a timeline. We've got a glossary of events, because often the Commonwealth seems to speak its own sort of private language. You hear about choggams and the cow, the committee of the whole. So these are sort of terms that are embedded in the interviews themselves. If there's a term that sort of perhaps needs some explanation, click on it and go in. But the glossary is there as well. But also, I'm just going to click on this, key documents on the history of the Commonwealth. And this is in itself, I think, a really useful resource. So you've got things like the Statute of Westminster, the London Declaration of 1949, and then these various declarations of principles, agreements, the famous Gleneagles Agreement on sporting contacts. And I think we're probably the only place to keep these digitized records of key documents all together online. I mean, the Commonwealth Secretariat's website used to have some of these, but they're not always available when you click on them. So as a sort of a compilation of different resources, it's useful to have. We had a news section as well. We had blogs when we were promoting the website around 2015-16. So one way or another, I think it's really it's a really important resource for the history of the Commonwealth. I'm just going to point to one sort of final thing. And again, I'm going to do it the sort of the hard way, just going into Google and searching that way, because I'm sort of easier than going through my top menu, which I can't quite get to. So the Ruth First papers. And this is something, again, you see, we created our own little section on this, Ruth First Papers org. Ruth First, for those of you who aren't familiar with her, was a very prominent anti-apartheid campaigner in her own right, part of the husband-wife team with Joe Slovo, who's another sort of leading figure in the anti-apartheid movement and in the ANC. Born in 1925, assassinated in Mozambique in 1982. And partly because the Institute of Commonwealth Studies had very close links to South African emigres and activists, particularly under Schuller Marx, when Schuller was our director in the 80s. A lot of papers on South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement found their way to the Institute. And we digitized those. You can see really what's available here. So we've got sections from her papers in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, early campaigns, exile in the UK, and then her final years in Mozambique, as well as a symposium that we organized on her life in 2012, and then digitized interviews with which were held by the University of the Western Cape Robin Island archives, conducted by Don Pinnock in the period 87 to 93, with some really kind of major figures in the struggle and the anti-apartheid movement. Some interviews that my colleague Vanessa Rockel conducted in 2012 when we were holding the symposium, and videos of this symposium itself. And I haven't got time to go through these, but I mean, they're really lovely materials. The 40s, 50s stuff. Ruth Firth's scrapbooks, which we reproduce in facsimile form. You know, for anyone interested, not just in the sort of the anti-apartheid movement, but just in the sort of the texture of life in South Africa in that time, the scrapbooks are a really lovely resource. So we're very proud of these materials that we've made available online, and please do, you know, do use them, spread the word. I think there was, as I say, just finishing on this point, really, there was a sense amongst the editors of BD that we're often disappointed when we look at major works, looking at, you know, colonial policy in general, British overseas policy, and the history of particular countries, which are covered by the volumes, but the volumes then aren't used. And I think that's really missing a trick, because they, not just in themselves, but as a kind of guide to the sorts of materials that are available in the National Archives. So you can start with the BD volumes and then jump into the sort of the files that Mandy was talking about. I think are really, really useful. The next session, we're going to talk about the library and archives of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and also I think can touch on the Institute of Historical Research's library resources as well, with Aglo Rublak, who's going to talk you through what we have available. So Aglo, over to you.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for staying on for the second part. So this second part is really all about the various library and archive resources that we have at Senate House Library and the Institute of Historical Research that you can use to do your research into the history of the Commonwealth and the British Empire. So what I'm going to start off with is the holdings at Senate House Library, which does include the Institute of Commonwealth Studies Library and Archive. And I should introduce myself first, my apologies. So I am the academic librarian for the history collections at Senate House Library. We also, so part of my responsibilities is the history collections overall. And what I'll do in this presentation is I will emphasize the holdings of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies Library and Archive, which we are very happy to hold at Senate House Library. But equally, I'd also like to spend some time and introduce you to the Senate House Library's other resources that can help you research the history of the British Empire and the Commonwealth. And I'd like to draw out the benefits of using both collections jointly. So for those of you who are not familiar with the library yet, Senate House Library is the central library for the University of London, and we are one of the UK's largest collections in the arts, humanities and social sciences. We hold print as well as electronic research collections and also 50 unique printed special collections and over 1,800 archive and manuscript collections. We are located on the 4th floor of the South Block of Senate House, just above the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and right next door to the Institute of Historical Research, which my colleague Mike will talk to you about after my presentation. Okay, so starting off with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies Library. As I already mentioned, Senate House Library houses the Institute's library. And the library is an extensive research level collection that covers the Commonwealth and its member nations across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Oceania, and Europe. And the history and their histories as well, and also the history of the British Empire more broadly. The core collection of the library is located on the 6th floor of Senate House Library, and the collection tends to generally concentrate on the Commonwealth as an organization, the international relations of Commonwealth countries, and also the constitutional, political, demographic, social, and economic development within the Commonwealth. In addition to its library collections, the Institute has around 230 archival collections too. The archives contain materials spanning from the 18th to the 20th century. In them, many Commonwealth countries and former British colonies are represented, but some of the particular strengths of the archives are the holdings on South Africa and the Caribbean. Another strength of the archives are the archives and papers of Commonwealth organizations, such as the Commonwealth Trade Union Council or the Commonwealth Press Union. And the papers of Commonwealth Studies researchers are another strength of the holdings. And a further strength that is worth mentioning is there are a lot of materials in the archive that relate to apartheid in South Africa and international anti-apartheid movements. Philip already mentioned the Ruth First papers earlier and their digitized version, but there are also several other archives which are not digitized, which provide further insight into the topic. And on the Senate House Library website, there is a detailed subject guide that lists all of these archives in one place. And what we'll do after the session is we'll disseminate a resource list, which has this subject guide on it, as well as all the other resources that we mentioned during the session. So you can follow up on that later. Another really great resource that the Institute of Commonwealth Studies library and archive offers is its political pamphlet collections. The materials come from over 60 different countries, including current Commonwealth members and former British colonies. They largely date from the 1960s and the 1970s, and they give insight into the processes of decolonization and transitions to independence in many cases. An effort was also made to collect political publications from beyond the main political parties of each country. So you'll also find printed outputs of trade unions, pressure groups, and non-government organizations in these collections, which are a really valuable resource as well. So besides the Institute of Commonwealth Studies holdings, Senate House Library also has its own complementary collections that provide further material to study the British Empire and the Commonwealth. One of our particular strong points is in providing additional electronic resources for both fields. We subscribe to a variety of e-resources, which contain many different types of content, such as journal articles, historical newspapers, government documents, digitized primary sources, and much more. On this slide, I've given you a few examples of the types of resources that we have that relate to the British Empire and the Commonwealth, but just to go through a few of these, we have the African Writers series. This is a resource that includes key texts of modern African literature, which was published by Heinemann over the course of 40 years. We have the digitized colonial state papers covering the period 1574 to 1757. This is a particularly popular resource for researchers because it has a lot of documents that are handwritten and also bibliographic documents on British colonial relations in the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic world more broadly. We also have more recent material, which is available through our subscription to Archives Direct. Archives Direct contains sources from the National Archives in the UK, And among the digitized sources available as part of this resource are materials on apartheid in South Africa, a selection of 20th century Foreign Office files, and a selection from the confidential print series. Just to explain what the confidential print series is, these are documents issued by the British government between around 1820 and 1970. And these were printed and circulated immediately to the leading officials of the Foreign Office, the Cabinet, and the heads of the British missions abroad. As Mandy outlined in her talk already, this is far from the full range of materials available from National Archives, but if you're looking into starting with a few with relevance to this topic, the Archives Direct resource can be a quite good starting point to get an overview over at least some of them. So all our electronic resources are listed on what we call our A to Z databases list, which is linked on this slide here. We have arranged the list so it can be filtered by a number of subject categories. By selecting the top left drop-down menu with the heading All Subjects, you can filter the list by the category of Commonwealth Studies. And this will return about 42 different databases and e-resources that fall under that category. However, I'd also recommend that you try and broaden out your search a bit and have a look at some of the other categories too, depending on what you are researching. There is a more general category for history resources where you can find additional items. There's also a category for Black histories and studies for those of you who are particularly interested in Black history. And another category that may be of interest is the political activism, protest and counterculture category. Some resources listed here include digital sources that relate to anti-imperialist movements. So if that's something you're looking into, that might also be worth a look. The drop-down menu next to the All Subjects drop-down menu also allows you to filter by different database types. And you can also combine a subject filter with a database type filter. So if you're only looking for resources related to Commonwealth Studies that contain primary source materials, you could filter the list by the categories Commonwealth Studies and primary source with the second drop-down menu. The list also allows you to do some simple searches with the search box next to the drop-down menus, which will search through the titles and descriptions of everything that's listed on here. So we have a lot of things to explore digitally, but our print collections are also worth exploring a little bit further. As part of Senate House Library's printed special collections, we have 5 collections with material on British Imperial history, which I'd just like to draw your attention to. There is the Bromhead Library, which is mainly focused on the history of London, but it also includes printed books about the early colonization of Australia. Then there is the Goldsmith Library of Economic Literature, which has around 70,000 printed items, which cover British and European economics from the 16th to the 20th centuries. And this includes a lot of materials on British imperial economics, trade, and related issues too. The majority of this collection is also available digitally through the e-resource Making of the Modern World, which we subscribe to as part of our e-resources. The Porteous Library was once the working library of Belby Porteous. He was the Bishop of London from 1787 to 1809. My apologies, dates are difficult to say sometimes. But one of Belby Porteous's main activities was that he was a leading advocate for the abolition of slavery. And because of this, his library has several items that relate to enslavement and the trade in enslaved people, alongside some other materials related to empire. We also have the Prothero collection. This is the collection of the historian Sir George Prothero and covers the period 1880 to 1914. And this is of interest because of a good cluster of materials it includes on Irish Home Rule. And finally, there is the Ron Heisler collection of print materials produced by left-wing and radical political movements from the late 19th to the 20th century. Among these, there is some printed output of anti-imperialist movements and organizations. So that might be of interest if you want to look into that topic. Turning back to archival collections again, Senate House Library also has several manuscripts and collections of papers related to the British Empire, which complement the Institute of Commonwealth Studies archive. Many of our manuscripts are connected to the Goldsmiths Library of Economic Literature, so they also cover imperial economics and trade like their print counterparts. Besides this, we have the papers of the Lewin family, who were residents of British India from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. And part of these archives are Thomas Herbert Lewin's papers from 1856 to 1915, and Thomas Herbert Lewin was particularly interested in India and especially its languages, so that could be a useful resource for those of you who are looking into British India. Then there's also a detailed subject guide available on all our archives, including the Institute of Commonwealth Studies archives that have connections to enslavement. And for those of you who are joining us who are interested in these archives, we're actually currently in the process of updating that subject guide and making it a lot more detailed and comprehensive. So if you check back on our website about mid-May, there should be a new subject guide coming soon. So please do check back on our website to find out more. Okay, so all of the information I've just outlined can be found in our subject guides about our collections. The subject guide can be accessed on our research strengths pages for the subject social, economic and cultural history. The page itself will give you a general overview over all the physical and digital collections that we provide to study history. It includes links to the library catalogue and gives details on how to locate and access the collections in the library and online. Further down the page, you'll also see a list of individual subject guides for more granular subject areas, and one of them is the Imperial and Commonwealth History Guide. The guide also includes like in this presentation, overviews of both collections combined. So if you want to follow up on anything I have just outlined, that's where everything will be available. Just a quick note on membership. To use our collections, you'll have to register with the library in advance. Senate House Library offers several ways to join the library depending on your status. We have a lot of free membership options for students and academics, alongside paid membership options for people who are currently not affiliated with a university. But the library also offers, above all, free access to free day tickets to access our archives and manuscripts. So if you are interested in any of our archives, that is a really good option for you to look into. So just to finish off, I hope this has given you a good amount of inspiration to have a look at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies archives and library, but also Senate House Library's own collections. And I just also wanted to point you to our research support page before I leave you with our contact details. The research support page could be another useful place to look at, because it includes a lot of really helpful guides and videos to how you use parts of our collections, such as how you search for archives and manuscripts and how you use the catalogue. And on there, we also advertise our regular research support sessions, which includes sessions such as these, where we give presentations on particular aspects of our collection and how you can make use of them for your research. And we also have one-to-one appointments available online if you want to speak to us about your research topic individually. Okay, so I'll leave you with our contact details. You're very welcome to either contact me or also the Collections Development Coordinator for Commonwealth Studies, Julio Casasa, or you can also contact the main library email address or call us. So that's it from me for now, and I will now hand over to Mike Townsend from the Institute of Historical Research Library, who will introduce you to the IHR's collections.
Right, thank you, Olga. Right, I'll just share my screen. Okay, right. Right, good afternoon. As said, I'm Mike Townsend, one of the collection librarians here at the Institute of Historical Research. And I'll talk briefly today about the IHR Library and its colonial history collections, as well as some of the resources I identified when I did a finding exercise on the histories of Hong Kong and Singapore, as well as the history of Chinese communities in 19th and early 20th century Britain and the Empire at large. Just some context first. The Institute is just over a century old now, and during that time, the library has amassed over 200,000 titles. The main remit of the library is to collect published primary sources, which make up the vast bulk of what you can find in our collections. Although we also actively collect bibliographies and source guides, archive and manuscript catalogues, some reference works and periodicals as well. Chronologically, we cover everything from the early medieval period, and geographically, we concentrate on Western Europe and the colonial histories of the West European empires, North and South America, as well as regional and local history for many of our collections as well. We work collaboratively with many of the other libraries around Bloomsbury. So, for example, while we have some holdings on Chinese history, for example, during the period of Western imperial aggression during the 19th century, work on earlier periods of Chinese history or from 1949 can be found in other libraries, notably that of the School of Oriental and African Studies. The library's colonial history collection is one of its largest. Although we cover the colonial histories of all Western European empires, there is still a bias towards the British Empire. So, for example, we have comparatively more on the 13 North American colonies than we do on, say, New France at present. The one exception to this is colonial Latin America. Although not as large as our colonial collection, our Latin American collection is still one of the library's largest, and is at present weighted towards the colonial histories of Mexico, Central America, and South America from the 16th to the early 18th to the early 19th century. And since the colonial collection is so large, it's been subdivided into several sub-collections. Sub-collections include those specifically on bibliographies and archive guides, which also includes works on historiography, methodology, as well as broader subjects such as the historical memory and commemoration. There's also a general collection which houses titles on the general workings of empire, enslavement, again mainly about the British Empire, together with works on travel and exploration, including an extensive run of the publications of the Hakluyt Society. Then the other sub-collections cover areas from Africa to Australasia, each with varying strengths. So, for example, the African collection has quite a lot of material on 19th and early 20th century South Africa, while the majority of titles in the Asia collection are about the British invasion and occupation of India. And as with our collection, with other collections, new titles are added all the time. During 2021, over 200 titles were added, including editions of letters, papers, diaries, and memoirs, as well as works on historiography and how colonial past has been remembered. However, now I want to turn to the other part of this presentation. I knew within the colonial collection there were a number of titles already specifically on the colonial histories of Hong Kong and Singapore. However, unfortunately, I also knew that currently there weren't that many. Looking at the shelves, I realized the titles of published primary sources we currently have is decidedly patchy. So I decided to explore other parts of our collections to see not only what we had on the history of Hong Kong and Singapore, but due to my own curiosity, what sources could be used in our collections about the history of the Chinese diaspora in Britain and within the British Empire. Another reason I wanted to tackle these subjects was because I knew relatively little about them at present and wanted to put myself in the position of someone new to the subject. Naturally, my first port of call would be the catalogue, using not only keyword searches, but title, author and subject searches as well. However, I realised this might only find works which are explicitly on the subjects I'm interested in. And I knew there were other sets of sources within our collections which would also be relevant. Therefore, my next step was to collect and examine several of what I call foundation bibliographies, or you might just call them reference bibliographies. Sometimes, if you're lucky, a bibliography would have already been published either physically or online, as in this case, the one by David Parker. However, I also referred to a number of standard secondary monographs on the subjects I was investigating. Not only were these published more recently, their pages of notes and bibliographies pointed me in the direction of useful archive collections and other relevant monographs, published primary sources and periodical literature, as well as specific references to large bodies of source material such as newspapers and government papers as well. I also checked the bibliography of British and Irish history, about which my colleague Jenny Laux-Raragoul will speak a little bit about later in the session. My foundation bibliographies pointed me in the direction of some specific government reports, such as the report on Lascars and other Asiatic seamen, 1814 to 15, and the report from the Committee on the State of the Police in the Metropolis in 1817, references to which were specifically found in the notes of Sasha Auerbach's monograph on Chinese communities in 19th and early 20th century Britain. However, beyond these very specific examples, I wanted to see what relevant material could be gleaned from the printed parliamentary papers, which can be found in the IHR library. While I found Hong Kong and Singapore regularly featuring in the indexes, I didn't have much luck finding entries for Chinese migration or communities. I suspected this was rather a flaw, possibly in the indexes, rather than an indication that the source had no relevant information. Looking at some online government sources that are accessible within the library, I had my suspicions confirmed somewhat. In this instance, searching UK parliamentary papers online with the search terms Hong Kong and immigration or Singapore and immigration produced 6,703 and 4,409 hits respectively, understandably as well. The other main type of broad source I looked at were newspapers. While the library unfortunately no longer has large runs of physical newspapers, several online resources are accessible within the library. There are many references I found to specific articles in the Times in my foundation bibliographies, which of course were accessible in the Times Digital Archive. It was also worth exploring both this resource and the others mentioned here for further references not mentioned in my bibliographies. And as with other types of sources we will discuss a bit later, they were crucial to in charting and reflecting the growing hostility Chinese communities experienced not only in Britain but elsewhere in the British Empire. One of the collection strengths of the library overall is its holdings of diaries and published letters and papers. And shown here are a couple of what I call main focus sources on the subject of Hong Kong and Singapore history. There are also other sources of this type, however, where although not the main subject of the work as a whole, would still yield useful source material. Within the many volumes of Churchill's speeches, for example, one can find he gave a speech regarding the growing hostility to Chinese sailors and dock workers in Britain in 1908, while volume 2 of Alistair Campbell's diaries has several references to the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997. There are also several works on social commentary found especially in the library's London collection, which may prove useful. Works by Henry Mayhew, Walter Besant and Thomas Burke not only offer vignettes of Chinese communities in London, especially around Limehouse, at various points from the late 19th century to just on the cut, I think 1919, but also with most other sources provides insight into the subjective views of the authors. The last group of sources I wanted to discuss were the library's collections of directories and topographical and architectural guides. When relevant information is present, I especially found the directories interesting, highlighting not only the names of a number of residents in a particular locality, but also their occupations. Unfortunately, this type of information isn't present in all directories. During the course of this finding exercise, I also checked the Liverpool and Birkenhead Red Book of 1906 and discovered it only listed certain types of institution and businesses, such as churches, charities, and legal and medical practices. The architectural guides were an interesting case in themselves. Although the shipping agent, Harold Clune, was quite harsh in his moral observation of Limehouse after the Second World War, it was one of the few before the area's extensive redevelopment. In contrast, the 1957 edition of Pesner's Guide for the area merely laments the extensive redevelopment, making no reference to the area's long connection to London's Chinese communities. Overall, I've been rather surprised by the amount of useful material that can be found on these subjects within the library's British collection specifically, even if the range of obvious titles in the relevant part of the colonial collection is at present rather meagre. Of course, the Chinese diaspora didn't just gravitate towards Britain. Overall, the population was rather small compared to other parts of the British Empire and the United States. Therefore, similarly, relevant source material can also be found in other collections, notably ones for South African, Australian, Canadian history found within our library. Obviously, few libraries can be a one-stop shop for anyone's research, and this finding exercise has highlighted several limitations and biases currently within our collections. Notably, there's the lack of material in languages other than English on this subject, as well as the lack of voices from Chinese and Singapore individuals themselves. Hopefully this imbalance can be addressed, and thankfully the IHR is also well positioned since the Library of the School of Oriental and African Studies is literally only a minute away, as well as the vast collections within Senate House already described. This naturally leads to the need to locate additional libraries, archives and resources. There are certain specific guides which may prove useful, such as the Directory of Rare Books and Special Collections in the UK and Ireland, shown here. And as already mentioned, the foundation bibliographies I collected gave me clues to relevant archives in their holdings. There's also a number of online tools which may prove useful. You may have heard of these already, but many university libraries produce something called LibGuides, which act as mini bibliographies of print and online resources, and they're often annotated on subjects taught within their respective universities. There's also something called JISC Library Hub Discover, which allows a user to search dozens of UK and Irish libraries at once. And don't worry, the links will be sent at the end of this session. There may also be an historical society specifically on your subject of research as well. It may be worth contacting or even joining, since that can give you access to a larger network of expertise as well. And obviously, especially since the pandemic, resources are increasingly becoming freely available online. During 2020, the IHR Library prepared these portals of freely available online resources. Listed are approximately 850 in the first, while over 150 are listed in the portal on British histories of race, migration and empire. Also, if you know of a resource that can be included, each page has a form where you can offer your suggestion. And don't worry, again, the links will be sent at the end of this session. So these are really kind of like the lessons I taught myself during this finding exercise. So I impressed upon myself, gather foundation bibliographies and check what I call a wide-ranging resources, such as government papers and newspapers. They harbour obviously a myriad of subjects. Be aware that indexes can sometimes be flawed and even harbour biases themselves. Be prepared to use many different different libraries and archives. And again, if I was a research student just starting out on this, I would be busy attending the relevant language classes, even if it means only getting a reading knowledge. Right, so I'm almost finished now. I'll just give you some details on how you can contact us here at the IHL Library and join it. Thankfully, membership is free to everyone, and all you need to do is fill out a brief online form, and we can send the card either to you or you can collect it from the IHR reception itself. I hope you found this session useful, and I'll just pass you to my colleague now, Jenny Lelks, who will discuss the excellent online resource, the Bibliography of British and Irish History. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
So let me just share my screen. Oh, sorry. There we are. So yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction. So my name is Jenny Lelkesh-Varugal, and I'm one of the editors of the Bibliography of British and Irish History. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how you can use the bibliography to research empire and imperial histories and Commonwealth histories as well within the bibliography. So the bibliography itself is a list of resources, secondary resources that have been written about British and Irish history since 1909. As you can see here, it contains over 634,600 references to British, Irish and Imperial history, as that has been published since the 55 BCE until the present day. So it not only covers obviously British and Irish history, but does also cover Britain's and Irish relations with overseas countries, including the British Empire, including the American colonies, as well as the Commonwealth more widely as well. And if you're researching Irish history online, I highly recommend that you use Irish History Online in conjunction with BBIH. And this is really helpful for being able, as I said, researching Irish history or Ireland's relations with former empire and as well as Commonwealth countries as well. And on this slide here, you'll just see an example of Irish History Online. And it's particularly helpful for researching the Irish diaspora globally. And this example here shows what you can, Irish people in Americas. And as you can see, there are over 2,600 results. So despite being called the Bibliography of British and Irish History, the global reach of is much wider, and so the resources that make up the rest of the world are a really significant portion of the resource. So this map here shows you everything that has been published, excluding the British Isles that's within the bibliography. As you can see, it's particularly strong in former British Empire countries, as well as the Commonwealth countries as well. And just to quantify this map, this is the kind of top 5 countries with the highest number of records as of today. So the bibliography is updated 3 times a year and contains detailed information about books, journal articles and reviews, as well as book chapters. And this is an example of the advanced search screen. So what it enables you to be able to search bibliographical searches, so that whether that be on a particular author or title, book title or journal title. You can also search by subject searching, which is a really good place to start if you're kind of just using the bibliography as a kind of just to see what may be on your research topic. So you can search by a particular subject, a place, a particular person, but importantly for historical research, you can also search by the period covered. And so when conducting subject searching in BBIH, it's really useful to kind of as a starting point to use the subject tree. So there's two ways of searching it. You can either search by typing keywords into the search box at the top of the screen, or you can explore the different levels of the subject tree. So the first column on the left will have the like the top level of that particular subject level. And as you kind of click on it, and then you can work through to narrow terms and different levels until you reach the end of the subject tree, as you can kind of see in this example here. So when researching kind of empire, imperial histories, as well as Commonwealth histories, the first place to start is within the Imperial and Commonwealth level, but you'll also find relevant information within the Foreign Affairs section or level, as well as within social history. And specifically within this, some of the examples you may find useful would be within expatriates, which would also include a narrower level around ethnic groups. Another one, it would be around Indigenous peoples, as well as colonial policies towards Indigenous peoples as well. These three examples are by no means exhaustive, and so what I recommend is that you kind of explore the subject tree, as you'll find other levels that will contain relevant information for your research. So the bibliography also allows you to search by geographical location as well, and that is within the place names tree. Again, you can search it by typing a country or a town or a place into the search box at the top of the screen, or by navigating the other countries level as well. And so for more information about searching the bibliography, I highly recommend watching these online tutorial videos here, which will help you in terms of being able to search the bibliography more effectively, but will also give you some information about how the bibliography is updated, and all the links will be circulated after the session as well. So once you've found a record, this is an example of what a record looks like, and this one is particularly for a book. So at the top of the screen, you'll have all the bibliographical information. So that will be kind of the authors or the creators of that work, and the title and publishing information, which will help you when you're either referencing or trying to access the material in your own library or elsewhere. In the middle, you'll have the classification information. So this is the subject information. So you can find out at a quick glance what that particular resource is about. And then at the bottom, you'll have list of reviews where they are available. So this is really helpful if you're conducting an historiographical analysis of that particular work or that particular author, but it may also provide other journal titles that you may not have come across before in your research. So it's a good way of expanding your research that way. And you'll notice that there's lots of text in green. So the text in green is a link to a new search within the bibliography or to an external resource. And so this is really helpful for you in terms of finding out what else may be on your research topic within the bibliography. So in this example, if you clicked on Myanmar, it would open up a new search within the bibliography. And as you can see, there are over 700 results for Myanmar that are currently within the bibliography. So this is an example of a journal article. Again, at the top, you'll find the bibliographical information and the subject information in the middle. But at the bottom, you'll see links to external links. So this will be links to the DOI, where you may be able to access the full text if your library has access, as well as the journal homepage. But in some other resources that you may also find links to online databases such as JSTOR or Project News. So if we return to the subject classification information, you'll notice in the person as subject area that there's a red link to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. If your library has access, what you can do is you can click on that link, and then it will take you then straight through to the Oxford Dictionary National Biography. So in this example, you can see that Surindra Mohan has a kind of short biography within the record for the Tagore family. So what I'm kind of why I'm showing you this is because it's to kind of show you that it's really worth exploring the links within the bibliography, as they're often overlooked, and they can really help you in terms of kind of broadening out your research. And if biographical research is something that you're most interested in, or key features in your research, there are additional dictionaries, national dictionaries of biographies as well. And these are just a few examples that I was able to find, but obviously there are many more as well that are available. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about an example for how an edited book is displayed within the bibliography. One thing to note is that book chapters are called articles within the bibliography. So it's just being aware of that when you're conducting your research. And so within this record for a edited volume, you'll see that all the individually authored chapters that are relevant to the bibliography have been added. And all you'd need to do to find out more information about them is to click on one, and then it would then open up a new record for you. So once you've found a relevant resource that you have found that you think is going to be relevant for your research, you can navigate from BBIH to different library catalogues. Just make sure that you're logged into your institutional library account, because it will help in terms of the seamless process in terms of accessing the full text much quicker. So at the top of the record, you'll notice that there's lots of different logos, and these are the ways of being able to access different materials. So firstly, you can search by your institution's library, which may appear as the different logos shown here. By clicking on that, you'll be taken through to your library catalogue, where you can find information about print availability or online access, whether your institution has that or not. You can also search by Google Books. By clicking on the Get Print Book and then selecting Find in a Library, you'll be taken through to WorldCat. This is particularly helpful if you or your research is not based within the UK or Ireland, or if you're wanting to be able to if your institution does not have the material, but you want to request it on document supply or interlibrary loan. And likewise, you'll also have links through to JISC Library Hub Discover, which Mike talked about previously. This is a really useful resource to be using, because it links through to list the collections of over 170 national, academic and specialist libraries in the UK and Ireland, and is really another useful resource to be using. So you can also use the bibliography to keep up to date with the latest research in your field by setting up an email alert, which will email you when the bibliography is updated 3 times a year with new materials on your particular search. But you can also use it to manage your reference lists and bibliographies, and you can export references that you found in BBIH using reference management software such as Zotero, RefWorks or EndNote. And to help you do this, the BBIH's publisher Brepols have produced a number of online tutorial videos, which you can see, which are available from the links that you can find in this slide here. And for more information about using the bibliography when completing your academic work or your own independent research, I highly recommend watching these two tutorial videos here as well. And if you want to keep up to date with the bibliography, you can do so by reading the IHR's blog on history, as well as following the IHR's Twitter, which the bibliography regularly contributes to. And if you'd like to contact the bibliography about anything that's been talked about today, or if you notice that something is missing from the bibliography that should be added, you're very welcome to make suggestions as well. And all the contact information can be found on here as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all the very best with your studies and your research. And what I'll now do is pass you on to Philip Murphy, who will be chairing the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks to all our speakers this afternoon. Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes for questions or comments. So either use the chat function, or if you want to come in and ask a question personally, just put an electronic hand up. So we've got, let me just see what we've got already. Brian Irwin says, on the FCO 141 Migrated Archive series, does the National Archives online catalogue include files that have not yet been released? If not, how do you find titles? If I can see that further. How do you find the titles of the files? Mandy, do you
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
As far as we know, all of the migrated archives have been released into FCO 141.
Yeah.
There are some closed files and quite a lot of redacted papers within the files. But I'm not aware of anything that is still waiting to be released. On the other hand, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is still holding a huge amount of documentation, mainly from its predecessor organisations like the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office. These are fairly well hidden away, although there is a spreadsheet available that with a good patience one can go through to look for other material and then put in a freedom of information request. I'm afraid I don't have the reference to hand with for the spreadsheet, but perhaps that's something that we can add to the resource.
Yeah, I mean, do we have any sort of ideas? I know it's almost impossible sometimes to comment on this, about the sorts of materials that might be held back.
I don't think, I mean, talking about the material that's listed on the spreadsheet, my feeling is that very little of that has been deliberately held back. It's just that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has never got round to dealing with it and transferring it to the National Archives. The big exception, I think, is the equivalent of the migrated archives, the documentation from Hong Kong, some of which was returned in 1997, and others of which was sent back to London at much earlier periods, I think from the 1950s. And I don't know what the current state of affairs on that is. FCO claims that it will be released eventually, though it was all going to be closed for quite lengthy periods.
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the chat. It says India Home Rule records and records on British India. Any kind of fellowship avenue for this? I'm not quite sure what. This is Dr. Shripad Unde. Would you like to come in, Shripad, and just explain what you're looking for there?
Actually, yeah. Good evening, sir. Good evening from India.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, hi. Yeah. Actually, I'm working on India home rule movement abroad. For example, in UK or with European countries and US and at that time. So I look at that type of documentary. For example, British newspaper archives in Colonial, right? So I see also in your library also lot of British newspapers are available over there. So I need a fellowship for this. So any kind of Commonwealth fellowship available for this?
Not quite sure what. Does anyone know about, because you know, the India office records at the British Library. Does anyone know if the British Library have particular fellowship schemes to bring scholars over? Any of our colleagues from the?
Yes, sir. I know it's Charles Wallace India Trust fellowship for, but it is limited number 1 or 2 just.
Yeah.
So other Commonwealth are available for the special these sources. Actually, you are given a very insightful session today. I know very well regarding this archives. Actually, I work on the Bombay Presidency Police Abstracts of Intelligence and British Colonial Government records in Bombay.
Okay. So
and
have you actually? Have you been over here and looked at any of the papers that are available here?
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Well, I think if anyone could think of any schemes that might reply, perhaps we could feed those back to the questioner. I'm happy to act as a sort of go-between on that. If anyone in the audience or any of the speakers have thoughts on that. Any questions? Please, again, either sort of raise a hand or just write something in the chat. I mean, can I, maybe while I'm waiting, if I can ask Argula first, and then maybe our other colleagues in the library. Argula, have you noticed people, do you notice sort of trends in history, in Imperial and Commonwealth history? Are people coming to you with research questions which point to particular areas of interest in Imperial and Commonwealth history at the moment?
I would say one definite recent trend has been a very strong interest in actually things related to what Mike spoke. So the idea of diaspora communities is a very popular research subject right now. I think one question I get a lot from students who are in their sort of mid-career stages currently at MA level is related to Black British history and Black people's lives in Britain, but also the connections that again has to processes of colonial history and the longer history of the Black presence in Britain. I think that's sort of the main area I get a lot of questions on these days. And I actually find that one thing that might get slightly ignored at times is how strong those international and transnational connections actually are, and how valuable it is not to just look at British-based archives, but also archives that are, again, abroad, which is very difficult to do. I do think there is a lot of value in really having a strong look at those transnational connections between the diaspora community and the communities that remain in the countries of origin, if you want to call it that.
Do you have links? I mean, are you in dialogue with archivists elsewhere in the Commonwealth about those sorts of collections?
I mean, currently not very much, no, but I think that's something we've been thinking about a little bit recently. So at St. House, we've been doing a variety of case studies for a so-called collections inclusion review we're currently doing, and we've been looking at our archives that relate to enslavement, but also a little bit more at like our Imperial archives generally. And I think there's some value in establishing those connections more strongly, for sure, because there's so many interconnections, particularly in the Caribbean, that we could look into. So we're not doing a great job at that right now, but it's definitely something we're aware of that we should improve in future.
Someone's asked in the chat, are the military records relevant to empire and colonies? Where they're kept? Are they in the National Archives too? Are any of them held back, redacted? Mandy, what's your feeling?
I think I'm very, very rusty on this question. The TNA has a lot of material on military operations, but I don't know how recent any of them are. It has material on it has individual service records, but not any of the very recent ones. They would still be held by the Ministry of Defence. And the various regimental museums are likely to be useful, depending on what the researcher is looking for.
What about, I mean, the Imperial War Museum, presumably their archives are quite important. Yeah,
and the National Army Museum.
I'd further add to that as well, the other service museums as well, and potentially also as well the Families in British India Society as well could have a really useful online guide as well around where to start researching specifically around kind of the British Indian Army as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Someone says, can we just turn up and use the library, or do we need to book? Presume a reader's card is required. What do you need as ID? A couple of questions there. Who would like to come in?
Sorry, did you want to go first, Argula?
I think you should go first because
Okay.
the IHR is easier.
Yeah, basically joining the IHR library is very easy. No IDs required. All you need to do, as I said, is just fill out an online form, and we can have your card ready for you. So, and then you, then it's open to anyone basically. So, and it's free. So
as for Senate House Library, which includes the Institute of Commonwealth Studies Library, it's a little bit more complicated, unfortunately. So essentially, we are free to use for University of London students and staff. We also have Sconnell access. So if you are at another UK university, you are entitled to Sconnell access through us. We also have membership options that are also free for academics from abroad. But it gets unfortunately a little bit more complicated when you are not affiliated with a university currently because of our funding models. You would have to pay for a membership. There is a bit of a difference, though. You can get cheaper memberships if you only want reference only access, as opposed to access with loans that you can take out. So what I basically recommend is have a look at our membership page and see which membership might suit you best. And just a reminder again, the access to the archives is free. So if you're only interested in the archives, that was completely free as well. Hope that answers your question. Oh, actually also, and you will need just a form of ID to sign up as well. Yeah, and usually also some kind of proof of address if you're not a student or an academic at the University of London. But again, all of that is detailed on the membership page. So just have a look on there and you should find all the information there.
I just wanted to add, maybe one unfortunate drawback of the IHR membership. It doesn't allow online remote access to most of the e-resources due to licensing restrictions. So unfortunately for most of them, you will have to actually come physically into the library, unfortunately. So.
And there's a question from Roy Clinton. To what extent have the blue books been digitized? Is anyone familiar with that? Mandy, do you know anything about?
No, I don't. Sorry, I was just looking back at an email that I had from Gail, an email exchange from Gail, because I know the person I was in touch with then said that there were two categories that Gail wasn't going to copy because it was felt that they were well represented already. And I think one was the government gazettes, and I was wondering if the other one was the blue books, but I'm afraid I can't see the email. No, I'm afraid I don't know. It might be worth asking the National Archives if they know.
Okay.
Oh yes, now I found the email from Gail. As quite a few have already been digitized or are more readily available, but that doesn't take us any further.
Yeah, right. John Lawrence has his hand up. John.
Yes, I put a question in the chat referring to the Gail. I'm aware that quite a lot of the FO17 on China and the Colonial Office records have been digitized by Gail, and I've put a link in the chat to ones that I know have been digitized, and I was in a seminar where somebody was actually explaining the FO17 ones. It's actually a question of trying to find an institution that can afford to subscribe and has subscribed, and it seems very difficult to find out that information. But sorry, just as another aside, I'm studying Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Public Library actually has digitized all of the late 19th, early 20th century blue books, sessional papers, Hong Kong Hansard, and it's free on access, along with a whole load of English language newspapers they've digitized, but with a very poor search facility. and it's freely available through Hong Kong Public Library.
Really?
So that's one very small section of Blue Books that they have digitized, and the same may well be true of specific libraries elsewhere. But back to the Gale, I'm desperate to get hold of the Gale database because it's absolutely amazing. And they've digitized all the handwritten materials. Their search facility is fantastic. And I'm just amazed that London as an area of universities just is unaware of this stuff and can't manage to subscribe to it because it's brilliant.
This does seem to be. Sorry, someone's coming on.
Yes, sorry, I was just gonna ask. So I do see your point. We don't have a subscription to it, and nor does SOAS, which would be a really obvious candidate. Have you checked the British Library already if they have a subscription at all that you could use on site? Because trying to search through their catalogue was not responding.
I don't think they've got it, but
okay,
I'll check it out. But
it's good of you to make us aware of that. I mean, as you say, the issue with e-resources is that they're very expensive, but I can make a note of this and see if we can at some point invest in that in future, but it might not be anytime soon. But it might also be worth getting in touch with SOAS to see if they might be willing to invest in it, because they seem to me like the obvious place to host it.
Another fantastic resource which ProQuest do is the digitized South China Morning Post, which is a major English language newspaper from that part of the world, with a fantastic search facility. But I think 2 universities in the UK, Manchester and Sussex, subscribe to that, and again, nowhere in London.
Okay.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, well, thanks for letting us know. In that case, we can look into seeing if we can maybe get that sorted out.
It is a big problem, though, that there are these commercial firms that digitize records, but then the packages themselves are so expensive that with limited library budgets, it's often it's difficult to make the case unless you're teaching a very popular special subject in which they're essential. So there's, is it Garfield Lamb or LAM Garfield? Would you like to come in?
Yeah, hi, it's Lam. Hi.
Lam,
sorry.
hi.
A bit dark. I'm in Hong Kong at the moment. I'm
Okay.
actually the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Hong Kong.
Right.
Very interesting, thank you. Regarding to the questions about the Hong Kong resource, I have quite a few to tell you what to do. And actually our Hong Kong University homepage, if you just do a search, we have all pre-war Blue Books online already. It's digitized. And we have all the sessional papers, the cassettes, and also the Blue Books, and also some of the annual reports as well, relating to the government. So if you're interested in the Legislative Council reports, you could go on to the university homepage. And CO129, I just put on the checkbox, which is relating to the Hong Kong, but it is subscription through Gale, which is quite expensive. And if you are interested in the CO129, you could also go to the TNA. They have access over there. And the SCMP is available through the e-resource if you have the subscription to the newspaper. And I think the University of Bristol, they have Hong Kong Studies over there. They have some free resources as well online if you're interested in researching on Hong Kong. So these are the few things that I'm recommending. And also at the British Library, one thing that I found it very interesting is that they have the Far Eastern Economic Review, which is hugely resourceful and very interesting about Hong Kong and also South Asia as well, if you're interested in researching the area.
Well, thanks so much for those tips, and it's great that you can join us from Hong Kong. It's a lovely thing about the internet that we're able to kind of join up, and I think we should try and sort of maintain these networks and talk about how we can help each other with research.
course. And also I went to the Wellcome Library.
Yeah.
And the ICwS has really good resource on Hong Kong, some of the company archives, such as the Swire, Jardine and Matheson. And I also went to the Wellcome Library. They also have really good manuscripts collections on the medical foundation, the Medical College of Chinese, which is our Faculty of Medicine actually at the university now. So they have a lot of personal papers, such as James Kentill and the Sonia Sand papers over there. So, and also HSBC Archives in London, they have really good resource on Hong Kong as well. Don't forget. Yeah, these are the things that I know. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. We've sort of got to the end of our allotted time. We've got to past 4 o'clock, but it's been a really fascinating subject. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to all our speakers.